The Minds of Meaning Podcast. The Minds of Meaning Podcast. A podcast where we grow together in understanding the unique ways that God has created us. Here's our host, Austin Anderson.
Hello and welcome to the Minds of Meaning podcast. My name is Austin Anderson. I am very much looking forward to this podcast experience with you all. It's been a long time coming, and I am just thrilled to be with you here in the first of what we hope to be many episodes of the Minds of Meaning podcast. What is this podcast about? Well, it's a podcast where we grow together in understanding the ways that God has created us. And that's very important to me. And it's also a way to bring awareness to mental health and neuroimmune illnesses. And we'll talk more about that as we progress here in the podcast. Every episode will have an interview featuring a guest or guests who will help guide us in some facet of our faith in Christ, whether that's an expert on a topic or a pastor or some kind of leader in critical thinking. This week, I start off with my parents, Dr. Warren and Lea Anderson. This is not going to be some sort of family interview show, but the reason I wanted to include them is because the whole meaning of this podcast and the ministry that I'm wanting to bring forth deals with an awareness to an illness that I suffered when I was younger, and I want to bring hope to those with some similar diagnoses. And normally, I'll expect the episodes to be somewhere between 30 to 60 minutes. However, I believe it was really important in this first episode to get the context of my recovery story. So the interview alone is much longer than it will be in future weeks, but it'll help set a good foundation to understanding why we are where we are in terms of the ministry. So without further ado, here is our discussion. I started by asking my parents where they first saw something was off in my development.
Well, I think there were some initial things that Mom was more hip to than I initially. And maybe what would be good at this point would be to kind of, before we dive into the specific things that we noticed, maybe the reflections that you had, Lea, because your concerns were realized before mine were. In fact, I needed a little bit of convincing along the way. So maybe you could share about your initial recognition that there might be something that needed to be addressed, and then I can jump into the specific things that, as we went through the therapeutic modalities, we were able to articulate a little bit better.
I have some education in physical therapy, and some of the education included early childhood development. So as probably an anxious parent anyway, I was looking at the developmental milestones pretty frequently. And Austin was way ahead of the game on everything and growing, just doing great. And about 18 months, we noticed that his development wasn't going the same. And it was just getting more challenging to keep him comforted, to play with him and get response. In fact, I remember checking out lots and lots of books on how to play with an 18-month-old. And then it was a series of books, and as the child got older, there were different activities to do because I thought it was me. I just didn't know how to engage Austin to get a response that I was satisfied with. So those were some of my earlier observations.
Yeah, we also have, both my brother and my sister have degrees in psychology, and unbeknownst to us, at least initially, they were observing some similar things that raised their concern just a little bit. I guess looking back now with hindsight, there were 4 areas that, as we look back on it, were clear indicators that there was a problem. The first was the loss of the language that had been developing up to about that 18-month period. And maybe we can jump in with extra ideas, Lea, for each one of these as we go along. So you were much more on top of this than I was. I just assumed that because Austin was a boy and boys develop more slowly than girls, that was an issue that would eventually take care of itself. I also assumed that because Austin has, even at that time and still today, a very precocious older sister who was in those early months doing a lot of talking. I just kind of assumed that she was doing some of the talking for him and that eventually he would want to jabber back at her and that the problem would resolve itself. But you were more on top of that.
One of the mile markers that I was looking for along the way was sound and word developments. And Austin was getting pretty close to the age of 2. And I'm not current on these things right now. But for example, our pediatrician said probably should have 10 words by the age of 2 at least. And maybe had 1 or 2. So that was one area.
And I think what really was the kicker for me is, Austin, we took you to a speech and language pathologist and did a workup. And the test at that time came back that you were in the 2nd and 3rd percentile, those things that speech and language people look for. And so that got my attention in a hurry. And so that kind of was, for me anyway, the deciding factor that made me realize we needed to be all in on this. The second one was extreme shyness publicly, which anybody who knows you, Austin, now would say that you righted that ship in a hurry and continue to do so. But at that time, when someone come to the door, we were living on campus at that time, and occasionally students would pop by to turn in a paper or something like that. And you would run to hide behind my leg if mom was at the door, or mom's leg if I was at the door, and just really shy among strangers. Anything you want to add to that, Leah?
One of the things along those lines, then as we became more educated about what was happening and more observant, noticed that it was difficult for Austin to make eye contact with people. So that probably went along with it. And then as we understood it, the whys behind that. And then trying to help Austin get adjusted to the nursery. A lot of kids have difficulty with church nursery. So it didn't surprise me, but it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. Like, first of all, I would drop him off, and within 10 minutes, the nursery workers would come and get me. And then every week it got shorter and shorter and shorter. And so an extreme point was when I left him and I didn't even get out the door. And he was so upset with crying that he vomited. I just was like, this is not working.
The third one, and again, we were hip to these things more so in hindsight after we started working through the treatments, but an inability to process sensory stimulation. All 5 senses have an example or two. It was clear that parts of the brain that help process sensory stimuli were not doing the job well because all 5 senses could become overloaded very quickly and easily. Later, we understood a little bit more when we started having Austin do sensory integration therapy with occupational therapists and all kinds of other things. But really, all 5 senses ended up being at play here in the lack of the body's ability to process all that stimulus. Just an example, I remember when we went as a family to the Elgin 4th of July Day parade, and the fire truck came by with the siren. And the siren certainly was loud. I mean, no question about that. And loud to the point of being obnoxious. But most people just kind of covered their ears and knew that it would be over soon. But Austin it just really freaked him out. And to the point that it was beyond normal. And also physical touch. Things like playing with Leah's hair, just looking for things to do. My brother would do what he called the roll machine when we were living in the campus apartments, and he would wrap Austin and Amy up and squeeze them tight and roll across the floor. And it was clear that not only was a lot of fun, Austin laughed and Amy laughed too, because it's kind of a fun thing to do with your uncle, but also it was very obvious that kind of calmed Austin down a little bit and was helping to process some of that stimuli, the deep pressure, those kinds of things. So there are others that were, all 5 senses were affected. And then the last one, the fourth one, again, and all this in hindsight, we're putting the pieces together as we were going along, was kind of some OCD behaviors that would be repetitive and very noticeable.
The example I was thinking, and then this connects to the dysregulation in the processing, like visual processing, we would go to the grocery store and the automatic doors, Austin would stop and watch them open and close. And he'd want to watch it again, open and close. And then things like fans and driving, he would get really excited with bridges. So things that stimulated his visual senses.
Yeah, so those are a lot of good points that you guys bring out. So obviously we get from the discussion of having the illness or recognizing that there are symptoms of something that's abnormal. So how do we get from that point to the point of seeing different specialists and eventually landing with Dr. Goldberg, which was the doctor that helped my healing process?
Yeah, well, there are so many crazy things that came together, and it was miraculous how all of the things came together and worked out. Once I finally was convinced, another thing that helped me get to this point where I caught up with Mom as far as what we needed to do was someone gave us the book, I think Karen did maybe, Let Me Hear Your Voice, which was for many of us at that time kind of the Bible of autism recovery. And I remember Mom driving home and I was sitting in the front seat of the Corsica, I think it was, and we were driving back from Cincinnati and I'm reading this book and it's almost like a perfect description of what was going on for us. And at that point, the author, Catherine Morris, and that's a pseudonym, but she had not one but two children who had recovered from what was being diagnosed as autism. And primary way that they were able to do this was through a therapeutic modality called applied behavior analysis, which was founded by a doc out at UCLA, Ivar Lovaas. And in Lovaas's experiments, 49 or 50 or 51%, close to half of the kids who were diagnosed with what they called autism recovered by doing pretty much this therapy. And so in my way of thinking, well, that's a coin flip. And if we can get onto this therapy, we're going to give Austin a fighting chance of putting this in the rearview mirror. And so I became pretty obsessed with trying to find Lovaas therapy or applied behavioral analysis therapy or discrete trial therapy, all of it's the same stuff, and went on probably about a 10-day mission, maybe less than that, because we got some things answered pretty quickly, and to try to find someone who could begin that process with us. And I remember calling the state of Wisconsin, for whatever reason, was and continues to be very much a leading light in this kind of treatment. The Wisconsin Early Autism Project, WEEP, is still going on. And at that time, it was one of the few places. And we actually briefly contemplated moving to Wisconsin because they were doing things in the school system that now many schools, Illinois is doing it very regularly now, 25 years later, but very few people were doing it back then. Wisconsin was one of them. And so we went on a course to try to find someone who could do Lovaas therapy with us. And there's probably one story that's worth mentioning because it speaks to the way we feel God orchestrated the events in your life to allow for the recovery. I remember we were living in campus apartments number 2 at the time, and Mom had to go out for something like diapers or something. It was a quick run to the store, and she was just going to go out and do a quick run, come back, and I stayed home with you and Amy. And Mom decided, because of time, to run up to what is now Butera, and Mom never shopped there. She preferred going up to Jewel and was much more comfortable with the Jewel store and knew that store. And why she went to Eagle, we don't really know, except that it was close and quick, and she thought she could get in, get out, get back home, and not spend too much time away from the family. Well, she goes in there and sees down one of the aisles one of our former students, Carla McDivitt, who was one of the very first students when we were in Ohio Hall as house parents. She was in the first class of young ladies that were part of our ministry in Ohio Hall. And because of all that was going on, and you can jump in here if you want to correct any misperceptions that I have here, but for all that was going on, I remember you saying, I didn't really want to talk to Carla because Carla's going to say, hi, Leah, good to see you. How's it going? And you're going to have to respond, well, not so well. And you didn't want to get emotional in front of Carla and all that kind of stuff because we were in the thick of it at that point. And, our heads are swimming. We have no idea if we're going to be able to get out of this or anything or how the future looks like. It really was a lot.
Well, I didn't want to take much time away I wanted to get back home, but I thought, I should probably just say hi. So I went down to say, hi, Carla. And she's already graduated. What are you up to these days? And she said, well, I'm doing some therapy in homes with kids. And I go, well, what kind of therapy? And she said, well, it's with kids who may have an autism diagnosis. I go, well, what kind of therapy is it? And she goes, well, it's called Lovaas therapy. And I said, you have got to be kidding. Because the only thing we knew at the time was that this was being done in Los Angeles and maybe Wisconsin. And we had called both of those centers and they knew of nothing organized in the area which we lived in. So it was just like, oh my goodness. And it had dropped in my lap. I said, all right. And then I gave her a little bit of background. I said, let's stay in touch. And then Carla did help us get started with therapy with Austin at home.
Yeah. So that was a huge, huge thing to kind of get the ball rolling. And we ended up working with the Center for Autism and Related Disorders out of Southern California. Flew in a therapist and just built the network from there.
Yeah. And you talk about how this was in Southern California. And ironically enough, Dr. Michael Goldberg, who ended up doing a little more of the medication side of things, is also from Southern California. If you wouldn't mind kind of bringing in A, how you kind of got in touch with them, and then B, how he interacted with the Lovaas. I know there are some differences in what they were doing a little bit, but also some similarities. So I wouldn't mind just kind of elaborating in that front of how that kind of congruently worked together.
All right, I'll start. We got connected with Dr. Goldberg when my mom was a concerned grandmother, and she was just sharing with some of her family friends what we were learning about Austin's health. And they said, well, our grandson's having that same challenge. So they said, well, maybe the kids should talk to each other. So we had a phone call with these family friends, and they had been in touch from someone in their vicinity who was getting treatment from Dr. Goldberg. And I don't remember how they first found him, but they were getting some results. So they had decided they're going to go see him. And then we shared that we had made contact with the therapy plan. They guided us to the doctor and we guided them to the therapy.
So there's that element of it. And thanks, Mom, for sharing. What was Dr. Goldberg's kind of methodology of trying to go about trying to help those who have these symptoms? And then how does that, once you explain that, how does that congruently kind of work with what Lovaas's practices are?
Yeah, Dr. Goldberg, as a pediatrician, was seeing more and more children come into his office with diagnoses of autism. And it was, as a scientist, it was intriguing to him, but he also had a personal component to it in that his wife at the time was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome. And one of their children, kind of in jest, but kind of serious, said, hey, Dad, why don't you figure out what's wrong with Mom and treat her? And he started doing a lot of blood work, both on his wife and then comparing it with some of the blood work that he was doing on these kids who were coming in with diagnoses of autism. And there were alarming similarities. And so he began looking at biomedical ways to address some of these things. And to try to sum up here briefly, does a bit of a disservice, but in essence, he likens what he calls Neuro-Immune Dysfunction Syndrome, or NIDS. He thinks that what many children who get an autism diagnosis actually have is not the classic autism that we see, for instance, in the movie Rain Man, perhaps most famously in popular culture, the Dustin Hoffman character, who is kind of like a savant with numbers and other things like that. He thinks what is actually happening is that the body is working against itself, kind of in an autoimmune capacity, and ended up coming up with a treatment modality that addressed some of those things.
Yeah, he went on to also describe it as complex viral, complex immune system disorders. So there are factors he felt like were stressing young kids' immune systems, and then therefore the body went into an autoimmune response. So some of the factors he felt were viruses that were sort of under the radar, they were causing immune system reactions. And then also perhaps, although this is not very popular thinking these days, but perhaps getting too many immunizations at once on an undeveloped immune system. And also without checking their blood work if their immune system was already stressed or not. And the combination of those things, along with maybe diet that was irritating the immune system, those stressors were dysregulating the immune system. And then that caused the body to go into inflammatory response, probably caused some swelling in the blood flow to certain areas of the brain, and therefore threw off the balance of the brain working together as a whole.
Well, that's great. And just kind of discussing all those things about how Dr. Goldberg was able to make those connections and see that and really start to see a lot of progression in younger children. I know that Lovaas, although it's prescribed by a lot of people, and correct me if I'm wrong, he wasn't necessarily connected with Lovaas itself. So in the midst of this, then the integration of what Dr. Goldberg taught and how Lovaas worked, and I know I had a therapist out in California that did a lot of Lovaas stuff, how that meshed and connected amidst the treatment process.
Yeah, the founder of the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, or CARD, is Dr. Doreen Granpeesheh, and her child was actually a patient of Dr. Goldberg's just in his normal pediatric practice. So Dr. Goldberg was familiar with Dr. Granpeesheh and all the things that she was doing with CARD and ABA. And Dr. Granpeesheh was familiar with Dr. Goldberg. And although they both would probably say that their treatments of what gets called autism are excellent, they acknowledged that working in tandem could produce even greater results. And so, sometimes it's interesting, doctors will get a little competitive and, my way or no way or all that. And we were very blessed to have doctors who knew each other and who supported the integration of the biomedical treatment and the behavior modification therapy as well.
I think Dr. Goldberg guided us with how to analyze Austin's diet, his nutrition, what things may have maybe irritating his immune system, because every child is different that way. And he also guided us with medications that were meant to address things that were stressing the immune system. Because his feeling was that if you reduce the stress on the immune system, the body will heal itself. And then with the ABA therapy, it's called applied behavioral analysis, but it's really so comprehensive. It takes all the factors of childhood development and breaks them down into the components that the child is learning. So you had a good example of that in some of your teaching the child how to first have attention and focus on something, and the strategy of how to do that. But it was just very education-based concepts of attention, colors, numbers, body parts. And in doing so, then the language would start to emerge. So it was just helping us to be very, very intentional with keeping Austin's development on track.
So then let's go a little bit more particular into my story. Through the Lovaas connections, there was one of the therapists I had was Andre, and she was very influential through the Lovaas understanding. What was our connection with her, and how did that manifest itself?
Yes. So on that journey, and I remember taking an afternoon off and just sitting on the phone and calling places. Do you do applied behavior analysis? And most didn't. The ones that did, the Wisconsin Early Autism Project, said, yes, absolutely. We'd be happy to work with your son. We can get you on a waiting list, and we are experiencing about 6 months worth of delay in getting started. But if we put you on the list, you can get started in 6 months. Well, we didn't want to wait 6 months because at that point we were operating under the assumption, which was standard knowledge, however faulty at that time, that the first 3 years were it. And whatever you didn't get in a child after the first 3 years, you were going to never be able to recover that. Now science is saying that the brain is a lot more pliable than that. But still, the earlier you get on this, the better. So calling around to various places and stumbled on, this is pre-internet or the very early days of the internet, and stumbled around the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, and they're out of Los Angeles. And I was like, okay, well, maybe they have a branch in Chicago. Well, they didn't. Now CARD has branches all over the place and on many continents. But back then, I think there were 3 or 4 locations, none of them close to Chicago. But I called out there and spoke to someone and said, well, we do have folks who will travel. It's not inexpensive. You've got to cover their travel costs and put them up in a hotel when they're here and all that. But we do have people who will do that, and we can schedule for something, and we can do that next month or someone, whatever it was. Yeah. So that felt like the bird in the hand, and it would at least get us started. And then we could always, deviate from there if we needed to. But Andre, her name at that time was Zarzadius. She is since married, and I think she runs her own autism recovery school now. But she was fabulous. And we brought her in and sat right in campus apartment number 2 on the floor in the living room and got at it. And it was a blur of activity for the next 3 years, and then 5 years probably, and then gradually for several years after that. But it was a cold call to the Center for Autism and Related Disorders, and they said, yes, we can send somebody out there. And we said, okay, let's do it. We don't know how we're going to pay for this. We don't know how anything's going to happen, but we got to get on this now. Here we go.
So one thing that you've outlined in previous discussions that we've had are these 3 steps to recovery. You talk about ABA and CARD. You talk about Dr. Goldberg and his treatment. The diet was the third thing. What kind of adaptations to my diet were made so that there could be possible success?
All right. Things that we had to remove things that may have been irritating your immune system. So the main things were gluten-free, casein or dairy-free, but there were other things that may have been irritants along the way. And there were, but those were the main directions. So we had to, like other parents are doing now, had to remove those things, but we also then had to find foods that you would tolerate the textures, because at that early stages, you had a very, very, very sensitive gag reflex. It was challenging.
I even remember personally a few times with that gag reflex, even in my early elementary school years, getting pulled out of school just because something triggered it, And I even have one memory, I think, where it was pre-cell phone, and I was kind of in the midst of recovery, and it was maybe 3rd or 4th grade, and I gagged, and Dad got called in and picked me up, and then we went to Target and then ran into Mom without knowing any of this context. It was like, what was happening here? He's like, why are you in school? I was like, I threw up. And you're like, oh well. So that memory sticks in my head. Any other comments in terms of the diet? Like, for example, what I remember was a lot of alternative, no peanuts, no dairy, specifically, alternative peanut butter, goat's milk, soy milk. I mean, just all those goat cheese. I mean, those kinds of things. Anything else that was specifically helpful in kind of letting the body reset with the diet?
Yeah. And this is before things were very easy to find, these alternative foods from the standard American diet. An odd thing was we should avoid whole wheat because the bran of the wheat was irritating your system, but we could use very processed wheat. So we're using the Wonder Bread. But the purpose of using the Wonder Bread was not the bread itself, but to get protein in you with us like a sandwich.
Dr. Goldberg said, get the cheapest white bread you can find, which goes against all the conventional wisdom about, you want those whole grains and you want, all this kind of stuff. He said, no, get the cheapest white bread you could find, because it won't have those irritants. And I remember, soy milk, goat milk. Mom used to make this great pizza that we would have forever with a gluten-free crust and then tomato sauce and then goat cheese. That was pretty much it, right? A cheese pizza we did. I remember the tofutti cuties, those little Eskimo pies that were completely dairy-free. So now, of course, there's an explosion and you've got Whole Foods and places like this. I mean, you don't have to do that. But then we had to go to special health food stores occasionally and a few other things. I mean, they were out there, but you sometimes had to hunt. But now, there's an explosion of things that are available.
We also, part of what was going on too is we used things like those tofutti cuties to apply the medicine. Otherwise, Austin would throw up and lose the medicine. So we had to dilute it in things that were pleasing to him.
Yeah. And some of those medicines, I remember there was one called the Rhina 12 and there was something else. And then you get these liquid things in syringes. And as we talked about, applesauce is one I remember specifically. You just shoot the syringe, right into that applesauce and try to make it good. What were the specifics in those medications that were kind of, without going into too much detail? I remember we talked about, some crazy off the wall medications to try to balance certain elements. Do you have some of the most extreme things that maybe pop up in the top of your head?
Cudapressant is a medicine that's been around a long time, and it's mostly used for blood pressure and been around a long time. So it was understood to be very safe, but it had a side benefit of being an immune system modulator, helped to regulate the immune system. That was the thing that Dr. Goldberg was saying. If research can develop immune modulators, that's what's going to help these kids. That one was an injection. So he gave us a lot of tips on injections aren't going to be too welcome from a child. So we were able to get some numbing cream to numb the area. So the injections were not too noxious. And for blood work too, because of blood work once a month.
Yes. And that was a big part of it too, was the blood work and trying to get the testing and information from that.
And you were such a trooper. We stuck you, especially the first time with Dr. Goldberg. He needed a river of blood to do all the tests that he was doing. And then to follow up, because the first test that we did showed that, oh my gosh, your immune system was so reactive to just about everything. Peanut butter, all kinds of things. And then the beauty of the way that Dr. Goldberg does it is you could track it. Even a year later, many things were no longer reactive at all after the treatment. And then a year after that, hardly anything was. So it really gave us confidence that this kind of off-the-wall treatment was actually doing what the guy said that he thought it would do, which was great. And to try to explain it, 20 years later, 25 years later, I'm sure we're minimizing the wow factor. So even the first year of ABA, there were a series of things that ABA does. It really, the way I described it in a lecture I used to give to my sister's class that was made up of future teachers, was it just breaks down learning into the very most basic components. And the data keeping on this stuff, we have 4-inch 3-ring binders, like 10 or 12 of them at home, filled with data that the people who worked with you collected. Carla and Vicky and Margaret and everybody who came after them, but just some basic ideas. And the reason that we had such hope moving forward that things were going to work out well. So in March of 97, the receptive actions, responding to a command with the appropriate action. In March of 97, Austin was complying at the rate of 63% for one command. By March of 1998, Austin can now follow 3 action commands. Block building, imitating block structures. In March of 97, Austin was building structures of 2 blocks with 1-to-1 correspondence. In other words, the aid was helping. In March of 98, Austin now imitates 6 blocks, random, pre-built behind a screen structure. So the therapist would have a screen there, have 6 blocks and build them, and then you were able to imitate and build the same exact structure just based on seeing that and going from there. Body parts. In 97, Austin was touching his nose 47% of the time. The command would be, Austin, touch your nose. And you'd go that 47% of the time. And I guess here, the other 53, whatever. And this was the only body part that he knew. By March of 98, Austin knows 20 of his own body parts receptively and expressively. So he can hear and touch his ear and also say, this is my ear. And can point to the same on a doll and knows the functions of 5 of those parts. What do you hear with? Ear, and that kind of thing. Just all those kinds of things. So, I got a whole slew of these, but that is one of the reasons that we dove in so deeply, is because early on, the progress you were making was so stark. It really gave us hope. Whatever was in the future, you had a fighting chance.
And that's an interesting perspective I hadn't thought about too much, was the actual quantitative results that were coming through, because, I always say, hey, I'm grateful that you guys threw a lot of finances and time into this to make it work. But it would have been very easy if there wasn't this data points. Eventually you'd be like, well, there's really no point. There's no hope, right? But these quantitative points really made it believable, as you're saying, from year 2 to year 3, we're able to continue to proceed.
And that's one of the beauties of the process as CARD does it. I'm sure others do the same thing too, because not only did we have Andrea come out, at least twice, maybe 3 times, but then every month we would do a conference call, and usually mom was on it. Actually, why don't you talk about the conference calls? Because you were there. I was with the kids, but all of our therapists would be there. We'd have the speakerphone on. And
again, this is back in the mid-90s and hard to imagine, but we didn't really use the internet. So this was a phone call with a speakerphone. It was a cordless phone, but we'd have therapists who had been working with Austin, all the data they had been collecting with the activities they were doing. So it was really, really structured. And then the structure would progress on every element based on how successful Austin was doing with it. And me and the therapist go through each activity, which Austin was spending, several hours a day on with them. In play therapy, it was in the form of play, but it was very structured. And then see how it was going, what the percentages were, where they were having trouble, what other things to try, and solving those along the way.
And so as we kind of progress in my recovery early on in my elementary years, obviously the formative stuff was 2 through 5 or whatever. But like as I went into kindergarten, even there were many aides that would kind of help me throughout that process. If you wouldn't mind just kind of elaborating more in the elementary years where I had a lot of hands-on help to progress, especially through the first half of my elementary career.
So what was recommended by Andre, and again, they had experience with several other children, was to have a classroom assistant for Austin because of where he was at in his progress, but that the classroom assistant would, because she didn't want to alter people's social interactions with him, keep him as normal as possible so that he could learn from that. The classroom assistant was sort of incognito. She was assisting the whole class, but really there just for Austin. We had to make some special arrangements with the school district for that. And she would get training from Andre on what things to look for and how to help Austin in the classroom, where he was having trouble with either attention or personal space or concepts. And really the concepts were never a problem at all. So just some of those fine-tuning things, just social interactions. So we had to work on that a lot.
So that's a lot of good information about the kind of the process of bringing in a special assistant to help out. What would you say the end goal of that experience would be?
The end goal would be, and this came out in the book we read initially, in the card therapy, and for Dr. Goldberg too, was to help Austin achieve age-appropriate developmental milestones across the spectrum. So it would be in cognition, social, behavioral, could be in a classroom like any other child as soon as possible. But I think that we're hoping the goal of like by age 6 or 7.
Yeah. And to that point, when we did the speech and language pathology in 2nd grade, the test, you, again, remember at age 18 months or 2 years, the results were in the 2nd and 3rd percentile. By 2nd grade, your speech and language was now, I think it was 95 to 98, something like that. It was not only age appropriate, it was off the charts for normal, quote, normal 2nd graders. And so you had made, in 5 years, you had gone from 2nd and 3rd to 98. Astounding.
Which is crazy too. If I'm recalling correctly, then a year later, I'm in the gifted program audition, right? And which is crazy to think how far that progression went from that.
The school district, by and large, Elgin's U46 worked with us really well. There were a few times when we had to advocate a little bit more emphatically than perhaps would have been the goal. And there were times when we had to make sure that the IEP was being followed. But when we went to the school district and said, we want to have an aide ostensibly for Austin, but who will also be able to help other kids, they agreed to it. Now, we paid for the aide, so they were really getting basically another adult in the classroom at no extra charge to them. But the school district, as we continued to work with them, got better. I think that would be fair to say, that as they saw how invested we were in your recovery, they started trusting us a little bit more, so that by the end, we didn't have carte blanche, of course, but we certainly had a better experience than in the first 6 months, where we sometimes really had to advocate pretty hard. Is that a fair assessment?
Sure, yeah. It was an unfamiliar scenario for the school district, but as they saw Austin improve, that was very convincing. And we made it possible for them. We weren't asking for things that they could not do, so it just was different.
Yeah, and that's true for even those who were skeptical of any part of this treatment. You're doing what in California? You're flying out there every year to do what? You're giving your son what? You're subjecting him to what? The proof was in the pudding because the progress was so clear and so obvious that even people who probably thought that we were a little nuts to go this route or to be so incredibly focused. ABA ideally is 40 hours a week to get the best results. We never did 40 hours because I kept really clear books on that. There was a season when we had several weeks in a row of 30 hours, however. So just 30 hours of those kinds of exercises wrapped up in a playful environment, but we never did the 40 hours, but we did probably the average was a solid 20 to 25 for 5 years running. And there were results that no one could deny. And so that was encouraging. And I think even the skeptics, we presented this to a doctor friend of ours. We said the protocol and he said, well, it's out in left field. But then to his credit, he said, but there's sometimes truth in left field. And so it's like, okay. So even the skeptics, as you continue to improve noticeably, no one could doubt that whatever was going on was working. And of course, people of faith attributed that to God's intervention as well.
So you would say, just for detail's sake, then by the end of second grade or so, it was much less of a hands-on aid, correct?
Well, when you were first diagnosed, the doctor told us some kids recover, some don't. We don't really know why, but you should maybe have plans in the future for putting him into an institution at some point. And her bedside manner was atrocious, and it depressed us to no end, but it also, I think, motivated us to say, oh yeah, okay, well, that might be the case. But goodness gracious, we're going to go down swinging. If we're going to end up losing this battle, it will not be because we didn't try. We used to say in the early stages when the recovery was in flux, people would ask me and I said, well, Leah and I are going to do everything that we can with God as our source of strength to be able to look in the mirror 20 years from now and say, well, we gave it our best shot. We left it all, to use a sports analogy, right? We left it all on the field. We are not going to leave any stone unturned, and we're going to spend whatever money it takes as God provides the resources. And he did. That's a whole nother podcast probably of how we ended up paying for all this. But we are not going to cut short this experience. We're going to be all in. And the results are clear, obviously.
The question was when...
Yes. I remember. Yes. By the end of second grade, maybe you can jump in, Leah, but I no longer had any doubts about your ability to function in school. I had no doubts that the doctor's grim prognosis of a possible institutionalization, no issues. That aspect of it. I had no idea you would graduate cum laude, magna cum laude, go on and get a graduate degree, start a doctoral program. That would have been beyond, even as an educator, my wildest dreams for you. But I had no doubt that you were going to be able to handle normal school. Yes, by the end of second grade.
I know there was kind of a point early, the second decade, there was kind of a point where Dr. Goldberg was like, we're kind of through the program and everything seems to be A-okay.
Yeah, well, you and I flew out to California. And we did that NeuroSpect scan, which was one of his diagnostic tools to see about one of his big points was that in a lack of blood flow to the temporal lobes, which control language and socialization, I think. So he would do NeuroSpect scans, which is kind of like similar to an MRI, and they would show a lack of blood flow. And we had not done one with you. But when you and I flew out to California for that 4-day trip, we did one at that point. And it showed that there was quite a bit of blood flow at that point to your temporal lobes.
I remember for some reason vividly being that age 10. So that would have been 2005. So that would have been fourth grade-ish.
So it was soon thereafter that we just kind of, we never formalized this, but we just kind of, Dr. Goldberg is so busy and there were so many more kids who were coming into his office.
Well, it was based on your blood work was in normal ranges over a period of time and you were not on any medications. So we knew how to manage.
Just to kind of wrap up the teaching element of this, there's a list of 5 things that both of you have articulated that are helpful in school settings. If you wouldn't mind just kind of sharing that a little bit.
Yeah. So when I would give a lecture again to my sister's class full of future teachers, I tried to make it easy to remember. So I put it in the form of an acronym, TEACH. And the T is trust the parents. And that's because even very early, I think it actually was the same. Yes, it was. It was the same pediatrician who gave us that horrible bedside manner when we got an initial workup for you, who said, again, some people recover, some don't. We don't really know. But one thing you ought to do is check parent support groups, because the parents are often 6 months at least ahead of the medical establishment in finding out things that seem to be helpful. And so we came back from that meeting. We looked up Easter seals right away. And I think the next night I might have gone to, and even at that, we haven't talked about him yet, but there was a guy working in the Chicagoland area named Michael Ches. And we started, before we ended up with Goldberg, we started with a guy named Michael Ches who did things looking at it from the point of view of mini seizures. So there was some indication that maybe there had been some seizing going on that had caused some of the shutdowns. So we did that for a while and then transitioned when we met Dr. Goldberg, and his protocol was working right away. And so we let the stuff go with Dr. Ches. But yeah, trusting the parents is the first thing, because the parents see the child 24/7, and sometimes educators get a little, educators have been educated in education. So they have strong opinions about what should work. And sometimes those conflicted with the reality that the parents were seeing. E is, again, this is being directed to teachers, educate yourself. And in just a second, I'll tick off some books that have been really helpful and some websites that can be helpful. But the teachers that seemed to work with you best, Austin, were the ones. I remember even one of them said, yeah, I went to a weekend teachers in service. I was flabbergasted. Wow, because, I'm working with your son, and I'm sure there are going to be others down the road. And so just taking it upon themselves to do some informal continuing education on the subject of kids with what gets lumped under the title autism, or now the autistic spectrum.
So at some point, too, we probably should give Dr. Goldberg more than just credit, but he encourages people, don't call it autism. Call it what you want, but don't call it autism, because that confuses people with the developmental problem that may have been there from birth versus what you had was an illness that was acquired and treatable. So very different approaches.
T, trust the parents. E, educate yourself. A is assimilate the child as much as possible. And even back then, there were what they were calling blended classrooms, where they'd have what they call neurotypical, or NT, with kids who had various issues, some of them cognitive, some of them physical, spina bifida or cerebral palsy, that kind of thing. But having everybody in together is a richer learning environment, and it certainly helps the child who has something compromised one way or the other. But also the neurotypical kids benefit from learning a little bit of grace and learning a little bit of things to make them better human beings.
Before we get too much further into that, there also was occupational therapy that was involved, I recall, in the school system, that the school system did help with that.
Yeah, for sure. We got our tax dollars worth out of the special opportunities that were available to us, starting with preschool for under 3. We did that until you turned 3, and then they had to kick us out because the federal program or the state program was only up through the age of 3. But then speech therapy, occupational therapy, all provided through the school, some wonderful therapists who worked with you. There are resources available. And when they were followed, C is consult the IEP. And probably the only time that I really had to rise up and get in the face of the school administrators is when because I would come to your class and kind of sit off at a distance. I'd drop you off, and then many times I would just sit in an area where I could kind of observe, where you wouldn't see me so you wouldn't freak out, but that I would be there just kind of having an ear to the ground. And there were a couple of times when teachers blatantly disregarded the IEP. And to be fair, one of the times was between February and May, when you had just turned 3. So you had to leave the environment of Easter seals, where they knew you and loved you and knew the things that would work for you. And the teacher at preschool took you in at the end of February or early March after you had turned 3. And, by that time, patterns are formed and, everybody else in the school had 7 months of being there. And this teacher all of a sudden has a new student. And this student has a fairly sophisticated IEP, but my issue was, okay, at least skim the IEP so that you don't go completely against what is being suggested from an educational point of view. And so we had to call a meeting, and we actually brought in the second in command for the whole district. It was quite a fun meeting. But the thing got worked out. So consulting the IEP is helpful. And then H is have a heart. And truly, by the time we started working with some of the teachers that you had, Austin, were so incredible and just worked with us so well. And it was really a good working relationship. But if teachers can they have to do so much, but to be able to look at the parents and try to find a little sympathy and empathy for the particular causes is really helpful.
Couple concluding points, but the first one is just different resources. Let's start off with books. I know you mentioned a couple of them in our discussion, but what reading resources could be helpful for someone who might be wanting to look into this?
Yes, and I should qualify all of this now by acknowledging that these are what we used 20 to 25 years ago. But I think most of these are still in publication and probably have a couple of different editions. Let me just point out 2 big ones, or 3. The first, we mentioned this, Let Me Hear Your Voice, One Family's Triumph Over Autism. Bernard Rimland, who is no longer with us, but was a doctor who actually advised on the set of Rain Man and had spoken into Dustin Hoffman's character and gave some suggestions as to what would be an authentic representation of classic autism. Bernard Rimland was the doctor who worked with Catherine Morris and her 2 children, both of whom recovered. So that is a testimonial that is very, very powerful. And then Dr. Goldberg, about 10 years ago now, after being cajoled by parents for years, you should really put out a book about this and let people know your methodologies and all that, wrote The Myth of Autism, How a Misunderstood Epidemic is Destroying Our Children. And that's full of his science and his rationales and everything else. And I'm sure he's got more things that he is bringing to the table now, but that would be a great place to start, even though the book is now 10 years old. And then, interestingly enough, I remember when this first came out, in light of COVID and people predicting for years that we were ripe as a geoclimactic, from a point of view of epidemiology, we were ripe for COVID, the virus within a coming epidemic. So I haven't read that since it first came out and didn't read it cover to cover then. But I imagine in light of COVID, we'll be able to look back on that and see that Nicholas Regush, I think, Regush, was pretty prescient in predicting these kinds of things.
So those are a lot of good reads. Any websites for those who are a little bit more on the techie side of things?
Yeah, I would go straight to the source for the major outside therapeutic things that we did in your recovery. One would be the CARD website. Again, that's Center for Autism and Related Disorders. And their website is www.centerforautism, all one word, centerforautism.com. And then I would probably go to Dr. Goldberg's website. He doesn't keep it up quite as regularly, but there will be some good stuff there. And that's www.neuro-immune-dr. So NEUROIMMUNEDR.com. And that's Dr. Goldberg's personal site.
That is one place to find articles that he wrote back in the mid-90s. And when he spoke to Congress, he presented to Congress about what his findings and tried to get funding. I think that was part of, too, what helped us to believe in him and what he was doing.
Those would be the ones I would start with. And for those in Northern Illinois and Southern Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Early Autism Project is a great source, continues to be. And their website is wiautism.com.
And one place I would add is I know Dr. Goldberg doesn't keep the website up too much, and, social media, isn't necessarily his strong suit, but there is a Facebook page. But any other final thoughts or things before we would wrap up our discussion today?
I see one other website. Did you mention NIDS.net?
I did.
NIDS.net, NIDS.net.
I'm sure there are things that are much more current, that this could be outdated information.
Most certainly. Yes. We experienced this 15, 20 years ago. So obviously the science and development of some things, there might be some more information that we aren't quite even sure about. But
yeah, just in light of your previous comment, I think we would be remiss not to, in conclusion, indicate how much solace and comfort we found through our personal faith and the people of God being what the people of God should be. And those who have a personal faith, science says that often that faith increases healing. And I would say that we were blessed in that capacity many, many times over.
I would also say that we couldn't have done it alone. As an outpouring of the faith, there were a lot of people that came alongside at just the right time. So if anyone listening wants to take some of these steps, if they have a similar situation, is just, you can't do it alone.
It was truly great to be able to talk to my parents about my illness and learn a few more things along the way. I certainly have many memories of my experiences as a child, but I am so thankful that my parents continued to be able to pursue a recovery for me until I was fully healed just before my teenage years. I am so thankful for that and the fact that I don't have to constantly be dwelling on stuff that happened in my past in terms of my health, and that's something that I need to keep in mind. My parents are truly my heroes. I look up to my dad so fondly in his career and education, his unwavering faith, and the ability to discern how to balance loving God and being compassionate towards the world around him. As for my mom, no one in the world listens better than she does, and she is very selfless in her pursuit of holiness, and I am so thankful to be her son. There are plenty of resources one can use to learn more about the NIDS illness as described on the podcast, but NIDS.net, NIDS.net is a great website to begin the search. If you'd like to reach out and contact me specifically about anything in regards to what you heard today, podcast updates in the future, or learn more about NIDS, feel free to contact me at Minds of Meaning, MINDSOFMEANING @gmail.com, or you can reach out at Minds of Meaning on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. In terms of what is next, I have a few interviews lined up that will certainly be captivating. I don't have an exact timetable on those releases, but eventually the goal will be to be able to release a podcast either every other week or every week. But please give me some grace as I get started here in this venture. Thank you so much for listening to episode 1 of the Minds of Meaning podcast, and I look forward to bringing more content your way in the weeks to come. Until then, so long.
Thank you for listening to the Minds of Meaning podcast. To learn more about Minds of Meaning, visit mindsofmeaning.com or Minds of Meaning on the mainstream social media platforms. God bless.